Hey there, it's Tara Garrigan, and I'm here to talk to you today about watercolor. Well, I'm an illustrator. I do videos mostly for kids, how to draw and craft. I also do time-lapse videos of my own work. Now, I'm finally bringing to you some watercolor tutorials for adults. So before we get started on our first painting, let's take a minute to look at the setup. There's many different ways you can do this. So I'm going to show you what I do, how I usually set up, and then just talk to you a little bit about different ways that you can also do it. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. Okay, so I've got a clear surface to start, right? That's always a nice start. I've tried working on top of crap before, but that doesn't go so well. So if you can, get a nice clean surface. Then a piece of cardboard is pretty helpful. Or a lot of times a drawing pad that I've used all the paper from, I will just use the back of that. Those are great. Okay, next step. I'm going to take the piece of paper that I want to work with and tape it down. So I've got drafting tape, also called artist tape or painter's tape. It's pretty much all the same. It's just the kind of tape that is not super sticky enough to do the job, but not ruin what you're working on. Okay. And you can tape all the way around if you'd like, or just opposing sides here. And on top of this, just making it stay in place, which makes it a little bit easier. It also keeps the paper from bowing as much. So if I were to do this whole thing in a wash, not just a small area of the painting, it would start to, pop up like this a ways, and it's nice to be able to avoid that. So that is a big reason for the tape. You can definitely use watercolor paper. Another one to use is Bristol. This is my favorite because I do a lot of drawing and inking, and it's smooth, so it works the way I want it to. For towels, I like to have a bunch, and I reuse them a lot. A bit of a pack rat in that way. I don't like to throw away stuff that I don't need to. So once a paper towel that I'm working on is dry, I'll just use it again, unless it gets real bad. But really with watercolors, that's not an issue. If you're working with acrylic paint, it could get crusted on there, and then you wouldn't really have a functioning paper towel anymore, so that's a different story. All right, let's see what else. So, of course, some of the better brands are the more expensive ones, and they're more expensive for a reason. I have, dumping my stuff everywhere. Okay, I keep a lot of my stuff in little travel bags, just because I like to bring it with me. That's the other nice thing about watercolor is you can work small and you can travel with it, which is awesome. So I have my bag of goodies here, and let's see, I like to use those freebie cosmetic bags. So Reeves, good stuff. Winsor & Newton, also awesome. Believe it or not, I have had these for 14 years, thereabouts. There are some colors I go through more than others. Blue, yellow. So those I've maybe bought individual ones, but my mother bought me a really awesome kit when I was 21, and it lasted me a really long time, or I should say it's lasting me a really long time. On top of that, I inherited some paints from a family member. And the way that she worked is different than the way that I normally work. So I'll show you. Here is my palette. I like this size again because of travel. I can put it in my pouch here. There's also the big sets that you can get, and I'll explain that in a minute. But I really like this for that reason. So usually I will just, you can see this color is run out, and I think that's one I actually need to go buy more of. But let's say we want the red. I take that back. I'm gonna put more green there, just a different green. Because I've already got red in this palette. Okay, fine. How about some yellow? Alright. So I'm gonna take my deep yellow. And then simply squeeze out a little bit. And I say, I mean, obviously a little goes a long way with this stuff. So that's it. And then when I'm done, you know, maybe I've used it all up, but usually not. And so at the end, I just kind of leave my palette out to dry. So maybe like a day, at least a half a day. And then that's what these turn into pretty much the same thing as the caked watercolor that you can buy. Remember when you're a kid and you get the watercolor palette? Those are the cakes. It's just dry watercolors. And that's exactly what this is too. It's just dry watercolor. So then when I want to use it again, I can just bust this out and add some water and reactivate it. Okay, so this is usually the method I work in, and mostly because I can wet the paintbrush just a little bit and use, you know, as much as I want, and it's some heavier saturation. So instead of building up a lot of layers, like doing a layer, letting it dry, doing another layer, letting it dry, if you do it this way where it's kind of more like the cake version and just add a little bit of water when you need it, when you're using that color, you can get a more saturated version. And then you can always water that down too. Okay, the other way that people do this usually is, so I'm going to piece this back together, but the paints I inherited from my family member, Gloria. She was a pretty great painter, I found out. I didn't know until after she was gone, but I think about her when I'm using these, so kind of cool. Okay, so what I did, because I really didn't like working with the big palette, but this normally comes in, you'll see this at the store, it's one big piece, one big plastic piece, and then there's a surface, you know, in the middle that you can kind of mix stuff on, and there's a lid that comes with it. So the problem I've had with this, first of all, is with the lid, then it, you know, contains the water, obviously retains the moisture, and sometimes they get moldy. So I guess my only recommendation to avoid that is either leaving it out and letting it dry, or just not using too much at a time, as far as like too much water. So I'm gonna kind of show you in one of these more empty ones. All right, I've got my cup here. So I save a lot of cups that I use for inking, and the only problem with that is that the ink does dry in there and then it kind of flakes out. It doesn't reactivate because I've got the waterproof ink, but it still sometimes kind of flakes into whatever. So you can kind of see the ink in this, but for the most part, this is clear. So if you can, try to use a cup that's not going to get residue from other paints and things in there. I will admit, I do that from time to time, as you'll see. But like to avoid that if possible. So, oh, that's stuck in there. Okay, so we'll use this one. All right, so what you would do, in this one, we've already got some colors in there, so I'm just gonna go with that theme. Just pour a little water in there. Can you tell? It's not even halfway. So if I know I'm gonna be doing a whole wash of yellow, if I'm gonna be covering a big surface in yellow, or using it often in the same piece, then maybe I'll go ahead and make a pool of it. And also you can start with just a little bit. If you want even less than that. And you know what else is important? Paintbrushes. Might need that. Yeah, honestly, I don't even really break into this pile too often, but I do keep it there for when I need it. All right, talk about paintbrushes in a minute. But I'm gonna use this guy, one of my favorites, my round brush. All right. And then you just kind of mix this into here. I'm gonna just blend the other colors in. You can tell I'm a little unorthodox. So I've noticed something about myself is that I know that I'm frugal. But I realized it has a big effect on my work because like I said, I inherited these paints, and I just work with these colors and the colors I already have. And sometimes I'll take a little bit of it and mix it into something else, but typically my color palette is based on the fact that I already have these colors. Not that I recommend that, but just a note about me. Okay, so I've got my yellow pool there as opposed to this yellow here. So if I want a wash or a really light layer of yellow, I go for that. If I want it to be dense, more saturated, I go for that one. All right, and I think the last thing to discuss, also, to take that back, second to last thing to discuss, I think this is probably something you've been dealing with your whole life. You're right-handed. Sometimes, it's easier to have stuff on the right, left-handed, stuff on the left. The water, I'd say that's kind of important where you're keeping it, because you don't want to, and your paints, as much as you can, just keep it on the side of your paper and with the hand that you use. So if you're left-handed, kind of keep this over here, because I've noticed sometimes for sake of saving space, I'll put my paints up here, but inevitably I'll end up like flicking colors onto here that I don't mean to. So it's good if you can keep it to the side. That's a lot less likely to happen. Another thing you can do if you have like it doesn't matter which size, but smaller cup, you can take your artist paint here and just tape down the sides and tape it down to your surface. I do that with ink, so real quick. So from Starlandia, a little art supply restore, which is awesome. But yeah, especially with ink, I'll tape that down because you do not want to spill that whole thing, especially not across your paper. That's not coming up. Okay, so lastly, brushes. All right, let's talk about this. Watercolor brushes are expensive, or they can be. I always feel like in any situation, it's good to start out with inexpensive stuff. Like maybe not too much. You get a few little inexpensive things. See if you like what you're working with. If you like watercolor, and then as you get better and you decide that you like it, then you can go buy the higher quality stuff. Because you don't really, and you can always use the lesser quality, at times too, especially with certain materials that maybe you don't want to use your nicer brushes on. That being said, don't go for the super cheap stuff because you're gonna have a hard time working with it, and you might just get frustrated and give up because the cheap brushes or the bristles fall out and all that. It's just not worth it. So anyway, okay, so pick these up from Blick, Lowell Cornell. These ones have been pretty great. I don't really have like a favorite watercolor brush brand, but I am going to explain the difference with the watercolor as opposed to like acrylic or oil painting brushes and why it is nice to have these. Is that they hold more water, so you can make brush strokes last longer because it soaks up more water, which is super helpful. I've got the big wide brush, the flat brush for doing the wash, brush across the page. And then most often I'll use round brushes. I just find that I don't have to switch as often. So basically it's like with this one, even though this is a bigger brush, I can get a pretty good small, like fine stroke, I should say. Or I can, flatten it out and get a wider stroke, which is why I usually go for the round, but whatever works for you, and it depends on what you're painting. A flat angle brush might work better. Let's see, last thing. This is the last thing. The other thing you can do if you don't want to make the pool, like if you don't think you're going to use that anytime soon and you don't want to cover it, you don't want it to go moldy, you can also just let that sit and dry out too. It's not like you're going to waste the paint. The other option is just to take the water, soak your brush, and then drag that. So I'm not painting this one because I have something on the other side. I don't want to ruin it. Good planning, right? So yeah, you would just do the wash, like cover it in water and then dip your color into that. So that's kind of the other way around that. Like if you wanted to, again, let's go back to this. If you wanted to use any of these colors, but you wanted it to be a wash over the whole thing or just like a light layer, a light larger layer, then you could lay down water first and then add that. And that helps you a lot with not having all the little brush strokes. If you don't want to see all that, if you want to look like a cohesive area, that's what doing a wash helps with. So that's why laying down the water and covering the whole thing quickly. You don't want to let it soak into the paper because you want, when you touch the paint to it, for it to spread out into the water like it should. Yep. Okay, so I will likely be back with just some simple how to do a wash, how to do this, but I'm mainly just going to show you that through lessons, through you know, so you can have some finished pieces. That's always fun. And yeah, so that's it for now with the general setup. I hope this has helped, and I'll see you in the next, or the first video. Bye.